Welcome back for part 2 of our historical background to Matthew. We left off with Persia being in control, and I want to say a little bit about that. Persia had a lot of advancements. They were the greatest empire at that time. If you saw the movie 300, it's the Persians who go and attack Greece. Persia builds roads into the empire. Persia has a Pony Express. They have the eyes and ears of the emperor. They had their own CIA. So they built all these things into the empire. However, that's the very tools that Greece uses to attack back at them, because with the next big figure in our study is going to be Alexander the Great. And he conquers the known world by 33 years of age. The difference with Alexander is not just that he was efficient and conquers the world so quickly, but he was tutored by Aristotle, and he believed that everything Greek was everything good, in the sense that everyone should understand and embrace Hellenism. So when he conquers these nations, he would show up and say, hey, you can keep your gods, you can keep your temple, like the one in Jerusalem, but you're going to take on our gods as well, and you're going to do things like us. If you want to get ahead in our world, you're going to have to speak Greek, and you're going to be part of the way we do things. You're going to go to gymnasium and stuff like that. So what you begin to see is this pressure on the family, on tradition. We talked about that a few weeks ago. And that pressure comes from the outside. And now you're seeing this struggle going on, not just financially and paying tribute and paying taxes, but cultural pressure on who are we? Are we Jewish? Are we Jewish who are also Greek? How do our kids get ahead if they don't take Greek jobs and learn Greek? And those kinds of questions. And so Alexander really pushes and grows and wants to push Hellenism onto everyone as well. Now, he dies young. He dies in 323, and this leaves a huge power vacuum. He didn't expect to die so young, and his brother tries to take over for a while, doesn't do a very good job. And it isn't for about 40 years that we finally get some stability under 4 of Alexander's generals who kind of divide up the house, if you will. They divide up the land into different areas. The 2 we care most about is the Ptolemies, silent P, Ptolemies in Egypt, and the Seleucids kind of in Asia Minor. Because between Asia Minor and Asia Minor and Egypt, what's in the middle there? Israel. And so when these 2 would fight each other and cause issues, whose land did they trample? Who did they pass by and take food from? The people living in Judea. And so we're going to see a little bit of that history play out. So for the first 100 years, from 301 to 198, it's the Ptolemies in the south that are really kind of running things in Israel. And there's some time for the land to get a little healing, still paying tribute, still paying taxes, but it's at least somewhat peaceful for 100 years. It's this period that the Septuagint is translated, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but just to know that this is kind of when that takes place. The Seleucids take over from 198 to 167, so they begin to push down, and we begin to see some bigger problems occur. Because with the Seleucids, Rome is beginning to rise in the west, and they're starting to push now onto the Seleucids, who then go to get more taxes and more tribute from the Jewish folks in Judea. So as we have now cultural pressure, we have now more financial pressure coming along the way. If you're interested, a lot of this history is actually encased inside Daniel 11, and I'm going to try to put a PDF on this video with that information there for you. But we'll probably do a class on Daniel at some point too, so we'll cover that then. Okay, now what we're going to talk about is a certain Seleucid ruler, and his name is Antiochus IV, and he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, and Epiphanes means God manifest. So he had a pretty big view of himself. He was a hostage in Rome for a while. He was schooled there. He knew their power, and so he was pretty afraid of Rome. And he really then began to push on Judea. He's the one who plunders the temple. He is the one who tears down the walls of Jerusalem. He tries to attack the Ptolemies in Egypt, but is forced back by Rome. So he was angry. He was humiliated at times. He was an evil ruler. And he really causes the people of Judea to suffer, including burning Torah scrolls, destroying traditions, killing families, and there's some horrible stories in the book of Maccabees that kind of outline what was going on here. He even goes as far as to take the temple and modify the worship, not from the God of the Jews, but Baal Shemayim, the God of heaven, the Lord of heaven, and completely inappropriate and caused major problems. So much so, when you have this financial pressure now, cultural pressure, religious pressure, all on people, they rise up. And the Maccabean Revolt starts in 167. And this revolt, in time, when these Maccabeans revolt, they get back the temple, and they're able to cleanse it and renew sacrifice there. And in fact, that period, that action on the 25th of Kislev in December 165 is what we have now as the holiday of Hanukkah. So they restore the temple. Eventually, they're able to kind of push out a lot of the tribute, and they become, for about 100 years, a free nation. And a lot of people saw this as kind of God restoring those covenants. They have a king again. They're not paying tribute. They've got the land again. They've got Torah. They have their second temple. And this is kind of a good thing, but not so fast. Because corruption isn't just from without, it's also from within. And as they get power, they begin to continue the Greek ways of doing things. And an internal corruption within the Hasmonean or the Maccabean party causes major strife because they're not being Jewish or being Greek. And a group of Jewish folks rise up called the Hasidim, the pious ones, who later become the Pharisees. They say to these Maccabeans, hey, you're not being Jewish, you're being Greek. We got to go back to who we're supposed to be and honor God and these kinds of things. And that causes a lot of internal fighting. So much so, it gets so difficult that they go to the world power at the time, they go to Rome to find some peace or some disposition of what's going on in their world. And Rome says, you know what? We got you. We're here to help. We're going to show up and, we're just going to take over. And so Pompey shows up in Jerusalem. He even goes to the Holy of Holies, and Rome takes over in 63 BC, which is now we begin this period with the Herods and then later Pilate. So why is Jesus living in a world with Roman control? Well, this is why. And so the next ruler that comes on the big ruler on the stage is Herod the Great in 37 BC. He goes to about 4 BC. He was called the King of Judea and Samaria, again, under Roman control. He was a friend of Octavian, and he really favored what's called the Pax Romana, or the Peace of Rome, which kind of was peace for the wealthy and difficulty for all those in the middle class and the poor. He was very skittish. In fact, he thought someone was going to get him all the time. He built huge palaces and fortresses in the desert. So Masada, Machaerus were built by him so he could escape there and live out his life with an army and food and pools and whatever else he needed in case things went bad. He had huge building projects in Jerusalem. He expanded the temple so it was more beautiful. He built ports. He built cities. He built all these great things. Again, using the people's money. It was their money that was doing it, but he was doing it for them. So there was this, again, financial pressure, cultural pressure, and he was kind of a scary guy. In fact, he didn't want to upset the Jews too much, so he wouldn't, for example, kill a pig, but he would kill his kids. He was, again, a very skittish, very scared person. And he even had secret police looking for trouble. So when the Magi show up in Matthew's gospel and Herod calls for the destruction, the murder of all these children in Bethlehem, it sounds like Herod. Now, a couple things I want to say about this, and we're going to kind of stop there with the history because this is when Jesus comes on the scene, is during Herod's rule. Life in Palestine, though, what was it like? Well, remember, you're paying up to 70% of your wages in taxes. And if you couldn't pay, you had to maybe sell a family member into slavery. So there's financial pressure. Your fields are battlefields at times where armies are coming back and forth across your land. Your kids are adopting the ways of the Greeks and the Romans, and that maybe cause some stress in your family. You're having your religion pushed down, other religions around you, and there's all this kind of cultural, religious, financial pressure on the people. And they're asking themselves some hard questions. Where are God's promises in all this, right? With Abraham, we had a promise of land, and we had a promise of a nation. Well, we're kind of more Roman than Jewish, and our land is controlled by Romans. And then what about the Torah? How do we handle that and God's promises of how we're to live? How do we live in this world that's Greek and Roman when we're supposed to be Jewish and the Torah is supposed to control how we live and act? And then what about the kingship of David? That's not there either. We're answering to Caesar. Is Caesar the king? And so they're looking for hope and they want to find what God's going to do. So they're asking these questions. Who are God's people? Is it us? Is it the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, all these factions that have kind of cropped up trying to answer this question of how do we best find identity as God's people? How do we get these promises back? These things that God promised to Abraham, Moses, and to David, how do we get these promises back in our lives in a real way? And then what do we do when we're dominated by somebody else? How do we live as good Jews in a foreign land, like when we were in Babylon or in Persia or here in our own hometown? How do we express ourselves as faithful Jewish people in a land that is not ours? How do we adapt and what do we hold on to? And again, I want to point out that these are not unknown to us. I think for a lot of us today, we find these similar pressures. As Christians, what defines us as Christians? What defines us as the people of God? How do we act in a world that doesn't seem very God-friendly at times? So the people in this day kind of held on to three things. And that was, they held on to temple, which they had the second temple. So the temple was important to them. That was kind of God's presence, if you will. They held on to the Torah, God's word for them. And then they held on to their traditions. So temple, Torah, and traditions. Those three things we'll see occur again and again and again in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus will challenge their view of their own traditions. He'll challenge the Torah, actually, in some ways. He will challenge their views of the temple because they were holding on to these things, temple, Torah, tradition, instead of holding on to God. And again, we can do the same thing. We live in a day and age where everyone's talking about unity, but we're actually very fragmented. We're broken in little bitty pieces because we're trying to hold on to something. And Jesus is going to ask us the question, what are you holding on to that may not be appropriate? What are you holding on to instead of holding on to me? What are your versions of temple, Torah, tradition that you're holding on to that are getting in the way of actually holding on to me? And so when we read Matthew's Gospels, we go forward. I want you to think about how those folks are hearing the words of Jesus in much the same way that we might hear them today, living in situations that may be similar in some ways that they had as well. So again, thank you for joining us, and we hope that this has been helpful. Next time we'll get together, we're going to talk a little bit about how Matthew actually writes his gospel and how he outlines it, and then from there we'll actually jump into chapter 1. So thank you, and hope you enjoy your day.